What's up, everybody? Welcome back to Facts on the Ground. I'm Misty Winston, joined by my co-host Jesse Zerwell. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Julian. He's a student, a member of ACU in Colombia, and he's going to talk to us today about the strikes that have been going on and the violence and brutality that the government has been raining down upon protesters. So, Julian, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for interviewing me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about my people and my struggles.
Yeah, of course. So maybe if we could just start with kind of like a brief recent history of how the strikes got started and where this uprising is coming from.
Yeah, actually, the origins of the strike date way back in history in Colombia, for me at least. We in Colombia are one of the most unequal places in the whole world. Like, we are the third position, I think, or fourth position. We have a really big problem with land redistribution. In some part of the country, we still have some kind of feudal nobility. We call them latifundios. There are people with a lot of land that don't use it for nothing, while most people and most peasants are starving. Most young people can go to university. For example, the acceptance rate of a local public university is like 5% or something. Actually, when I did the exam to enter University of Antioquia, I passed. 100 people passed, but 5,000 people did the exam. So it's something like that. Most people can go to university. Most public schools are really bad. They have really bad quality. All healthcare system is based on the U.S. It's not as bad as the healthcare system in the U.S. because we still have universal healthcare, but it's very privatized. We have high copays and all of that, etc. In 2016, we ended our war because we had a century-long civil war between the state and communist guerrillas, and the peace accord tried to help with all of that problem. For example, the peace accord had 30 points about land reform, something like that. But our current president, Duque, is trying to destroy the peace accord. He is implementing it. He is trying to revive the war, etc., etc., etc. That's why in 2018 we had a national student strike only, higher education student only, public universities striked that year. Then in 2019 we had a general strike with trade unions and informal workers and all of that. But the strike ended because of COVID. And right now, the National Strike Committee, made up by trade unions and some representative from the university students, with really bad representative. The committee in 2000. This year, sorry for the bad English. It's not the same as the 2019 committee, and that was a bad committee. So yeah, the committee called for a general strike. Some people went on the street. The strike wasn't really big, but the state repressed it really hard, and we're accustomed to state repression. With tear gas, maybe some fist fights and stuff like that. But they started shooting people on the street. That was
with live bullets.
Yes, with bullets, with real bullets, not with Nerf bullets or with, how do you say,
the rubber bullets?
No, real metal bullets.
Right.
And they kill a lot of people. They are killing 10 people per day, sometimes even more. We have more than 90 confirmed killed, and we had hundreds of disappeared people, some of which have started appearing in random places, like for example, in the valley of rivers, or are starting appearing in the jungle, etc., etc., etc. So we are sure that the number of deaths is much, much higher, albeit in the three figures range. So yeah, that's why the strike is continuing. That's why the strike is so radical, because this is the most radical strike we have ever had since the 70s strike. Back in the 70s, we had a really big general strike commanded by the Communist Party, and since then we haven't had that kind of popular movement. So yeah, that's it. It's for state repression, basically, for murderous state repression.
So, forgive me if this is a simple or obvious question, but how much of what's happening now, in your opinion, has to do with the so-called war on drugs that not only the U.S. but Colombia has been waging for decades now?
Oh, it has to a lot. For example, the murder of repression of the state is basically motivated by our main strategy in this strike, that is the imposing of point of resistance. Normally, in other strikes, we did marches, we did public demonstration, etc. In this strike, we also do that, but mostly what we do is blockading vital infrastructure. For example, I have a 6-lane highway, 3 blocks apart from my home, and what we do in my town is we just blockade the highway.
Mm-hmm.
And no one can go past, only ambulances and foot. In Cali, they had 6 complete blockades. One of them, the biggest in the country, is called Port Resistance, Puerto Resistencia in Spanish, and they are blockading the port of Buenaventura, another town that is the main port for which the drug cartel are export coca to the United States, for cocaine to the United States. So they are pissed about that because we are ruining their business. Our government is actually in bed with drug cartels. So we are completely ruining their business. For example, Álvaro Uribe Vélez, our former president, they found their family helicopter in the 80s. They found the family helicopter in Tranquilandia, the biggest cocaine factory in the whole continent. For example, our former president and current president, they are in bed with cartel, with drug cartel. So we're running their business, and for that they are killing us.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's very similar to.
Economy.
It's very similar, obviously, to what's happening in Mexico too. We know that the law enforcement works hand in glove with the cartels.
And you guys are actually sending our government money for doing that. For example, do you remember the problem about latifundios that I told you? Here in Colombia, I am actually an indigenous people, native Colombians. I don't know if that's the correct language. Here in Colombia, we just say Indians. Whatever. We are 3% of the population, but our local or ancient land are mostly occupied by big industrialists or drug lords. But traditionally, we used to cultivate coca. Not for drug use. We didn't process it into cocaine because we didn't have the technology, or we didn't like cocaine in the ancient times. I don't know. We just eat it. It's like coffee. For example, you grab a leaf of coca and you eat it while you go to work, and it's like having a coffee in the morning. So lot of indigenous people, like for example the NASA people, they cultivate coca, and our government is actually using the money and the aid that the U.S. government is sending to destroy the local indigenous farmers, saying that they are fighting the drug war or something, when they just really want our land. They just really want to use our land to poke on big industrialists of sugar cane and other crops. It's 21st century colonialism, basically.
That seems to be the playbook for Western imperialism across the globe, is to attack the indigenous populations of wherever we want to take over. They very often attack farmers in different areas, so that doesn't surprise me at all. I did want to ask you too about we've heard Colombia be called the Israel of South America, and Dan Cohen recently did a piece about Israel's involvement or influence over what's happening in Colombia. We also saw a video where Colombian protesters were lighting an American flag and an Israeli flag on fire. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what have you? What is your experience on the ground with people talking about the influence of Israel?
Well, most people really don't care about Israel because we are a third world country. Really, most people don't have the time to think about geopolitics. We just think about we have to eat, we don't have medicine, we don't have food. But most organized people, like for example, like myself, like the militants of the Communist Party, like trade union workers, etc., people that are actually organizing the fight. There are, for every 100 protesters, there is like one organizer. We do talk about the involvement of Israel, and we are like the Israel of South America, really, because, for example, during the last century, we didn't have any dictatorships. The U.S. didn't coup up our leaders because we killed the leftists for them. We did it ourselves, and the U.S. just sent us about a bunch of money to do it. We have 9 military U.S. bases here in our territory.
Wow.
If you go down the highway 15 minutes from my town, there is a U.S. military base, for example. And they use that base to make shady business. Like, for example, they were involved in child sex trafficking, basically, a couple of years ago. So yeah, in the 90s, independent journalist called, he was killed, basically by our oligarchy, but he denounced a lot U.S. involvement here in Colombia. Jaime Garzón, yes, what's his name? Like, for example, he said that the U.S. will make Uribe the dictator that we needed as a country. He said it like half jokingly. Yeah. You guys are actually very, very involved here in Colombia. The U.S. is very present. For example, our police and our military is basically reducing your year. Once your army displays of the year is given to your police, and once your police no longer has any use for it, we use it. That's why, for example, or the tear gas that the police is using is expired, like 10 years expired, 5 years expired, 20 years expired. And once the tear gas expired, it's become toxic. You actually can't breathe. This is something funny because here in Colombia we know how to differentiate because between tear gas and expired tear gas, because one just makes you cry and all that, and the other one is like, I'm gonna die.
So speaking of Israel, I wanted to ask you about reports that have come out recently about Israeli, or what's called the IDF, training and setting up and essentially training death squads to carry out what death squads do in Colombia. Do you have any knowledge of that? Can you speak to that at all?
I mean, I know I know that it's happening. The problem in Colombia is that we we are a country that is still at a civil war. The 2016 Accords didn't completely end the conflict. We had a lot. For example, we still have one communist guerrilla in the jungle called the the National Liberation Army. But that's on the left. But we still have far right paramilitary groups, for example. In fact, when we blockaded the highway 1 week ago, one of them took their gun and pointed at me and said, "You have to let me pass because I am with its organization that I'm not gonna name for my security." So yeah, we had a lot of death squads. A lot. Some of them are financed directly by the government. Some of them are financed by the Mexican drug cartel. Some of them are trained by the Israeli military, etc. Yeah, there is a lot of conflict going on right now in Colombia. It's really bizarre. It's like we're still in the Cold War.
Yeah, and what's shocking, I suppose you could say, about what's happening in Colombia is that, at least here in the States, we don't hear really anything about it. There's almost a blackout of sorts with regards to
at least in mainstream media, it isn't talked about really at all. I haven't even seen a ton of. Yeah.
We don't even bat an eye on it because that's what we are used to seeing dead people. Like, for example, in Urabá. Urabá is a region of Colombia completely controlled by paramilitary groups and drug cartels. There is no state there. The paramilitaries are the state. And it's completely normal to go about your business in the highway and you go to a town, and in the entrance of the town there are like two armed people with assault rifles saying, "Hey, you can enter the town because we are doing a massacre, so have a good time." It's completely normal. Like, for example, in Urabá is wow. When I was in Urabá, you can see the paramilitary groups patrolling the streets. It's like completely normal. People with AK-47 just patrolling the streets. It's weird. It's weird.
Yeah, that is. I mean, that's kind of what the United States does. We occupy.
No, but yes, it's completely an occupying army. Fun fact, actually. Urabá is the forefront of like where the Communist Party gets the most votes, actually, because those people really want to be liberated.
So we've seen, and I think you've seen as well, I'm not going to presume, but this resurgence of anti-communism, specifically anti-communism, and especially in the West, we had the Russiagate nonsense for 2+ years.
5 years, really.
Yeah, it's still going on. And I'm wondering how much it's this intense focus on just communism, as if that's the only opposition to capitalism, as if there aren't other political philosophies or ways of organizing things. So I'm wondering how much what's happening now has to do with the government's obsession, because they're so tied to the West, with specifically anti-communism. And this is something that's happened over the decades. It's not new, but I'm wondering how much that factors into what's happening now.
Anti-communism. It's mostly like we just follow the foreign policy of the U.S. For example, 1 month ago, they expelled Russian diplomats of our country. Yeah, the government did it. They used closed down on Russian diplomatic relationships. We don't deal with Cuba, for example. Cubans are our brothers and all of that, but the government doesn't want us to get involved with Cuba. or politicians are always talking about Venezuela. The right always fear-mongering about Venezuela. We are going to turn into another Venezuela, etc. In Colombia, we actually haven't had our first leftist president yet, because the left is always killed off, literally killed off, before we win actually one election. In the 91 election, we actually killed 4 leftist candidates. That was really bizarre. In 2018, they tried to kill Gustavo Petro, or leftist candidate, and he isn't even a communist. He's just a standard. So he loves Biden. He's a Biden. Can you imagine the far-right shit show that we are currently living in, that they are trying to kill a Biden?
That's I hate to laugh because it's not funny, but I
necessarily a
have
bad
to
thing.
laugh. Right? No, but
No,
the idea that
all,
like a Biden-esque figure would be too left is just it's bizarre. Like, that's absurd. It's just
he
it's
doesn't even
absurd.
want to do anything. In his speeches, he talks about the necessity to implement capitalism really well. He was pro trade relationship with the U.S. and come on, he's a neoliberal with some social problems. Sorry, but yeah, he's too far less for our establishments, I guess.
That's insane. This is really part of a more global shift towards fascism, really. I mean, we see it with Bolsonaro, and I mean, it's really just kind of across the globe. We're seeing these far right leaders being elevated and boosted by Western powers, which seems very much the intention. So yeah, the idea that a Biden kind of figure is too left wing is really absurd. And you spoke about the assassinations. I mean, being murdered. Leftist leaders in these countries are murdered constantly. I mean, we're seeing it right now. A lot of the protest leaders, activist organizers, social leaders, they're currently being murdered as the protests are going on. Maybe you can speak a little bit to that, the violence in the streets and the leaders of the protests who are being, just straight up murdered and, thrown into rivers.
I want to actually make a point about that, is that, like I said, we are used to violence. We know that we live in a really violent society. Like, for example, here in Colombia, it's normal for the establishments to do 1 or 2 massacres per week. Like the Trade Union Confederation of the I don't know the name. They always run Colombia as the workplace for workers, because we kill a lot of union leaders per year. Every other day, 1 or 2 leftist leaders are killed, etc. But we are used to that. We know that's just business as usual. This is different because they are killing people open in the street while protesting. Back in the Google days of 2 months ago, they killed people in their homes by night. Yeah, it was more secretive. Like, we knew it was happening. We knew it the day before. After that, like, it appeared on the news, or in the newspaper, or someone told you, and you was like, that's us, I guess. But right now it's more open. It's really open on the streets with guns, and it's more symbolic, I guess. It's a lot. There is currently a lot of symbolic violence, if I might say. We feel like being basically occupied by an occupying army. I was talking about that with my friends the other day, the day of the football match. There was basically police and army personnel all over the city, and they were detaining people. And and we felt like the resistance in Paris, France, occupied by Nazi Germany or something like that, hiding from the cops. It was really bizarre. I truly feel like we aren't living in a democracy right now. Like we just passed that point. I feel like 2 months ago we lived in an authoritarian regime with some democratic elements, but I don't feel in a democracy anymore. So, yeah.
So this is happening, and it sounds like it's happening with the approval of Duque. Is that the case? Is he almost, or is he acting like Duterte and just saying, let's have a free-for-all of the murder of
No, he's more
revolutionaries?
institutional.
He's more
more
institutional. Okay. Can you explain
He's
that
kind
a
of a
little?
puppet, yes? Pretty much a puppet?
Yes, he's a puppet of Uribe, former President Uribe.
Okay.
They don't say go kill off the leftists, but for example, when a leftist is killed, Uribe family said they weren't working on the fields.
Mhm.
They surely were doing something else.
Right.
Because of a long war with communist guerrilla, you can always point people to that. Like, they were communists, and because they were communists, they deserved to die. They were anarchists. Actually, during Uribe's government, we had a case of mass killings, called the failed, failed positive scandals, also positive, where the army killed almost 10,000 people, something like that, and they dressed them as guerrilla warriors, basically. But no, they weren't, they were just students or peasants and all of that.
It's very reminiscent of what happened in Argentina not so long ago.
No, but
With,
Uribe actually killed more people in 8 years than the whole Argentina dictatorship. Yes, it was really something. I mean, Uribe killed more people than Pinochet.
mm.
Uh,
And that is not reported, at least in
No.
mainstream media here.
In the
They
West,
don't.
no.
Yeah, they don't care about Latin America or South America.
oh no, your news do care about talking about Venezuela.
Right.
Well, yeah,
It,
we only talk about the people who we've yet to overthrow and install our own puppet dictators. That's the only people that we really care about, and we do care about those places, but we only care about them insofar as that we can exploit their resources and take over their countries. So yeah, that's. But the violence on the streets, because I mean, this current round of strikes started because of tax policy, correct? Like a
Yeah.
neoliberal tax policy. But that was rescinded. A couple of ministers, I think, were kicked out or whatever. It seemed like they were trying to placate the protesters, which clearly didn't work because they also ramped up the violence in the streets, which brought a lot of the youth protesters out. So like you said earlier, this was started by the National Strike Committee, but that committee has now become sort of irrelevant. It's out of their hands now. It's gotten much bigger than that. Can you talk about how the strikes kind of grew and how this movement, because it's really been taken over by the youth, which I think is something that we see in most uprisings, that the young people are the ones that usually lead the way. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. No, yeah, the National Strike Committee made up by basically trade unions. Of student representatives, we had two of them. One was a representative from the Communist Youth, but he resigned, and the other one was Jennifer Pedraza, a sort of liberal activist. That she's a zealot. She sold the 2018 strike. We don't trust her, basically. So we don't have any representation really in the National Strike Committee. The National Strike Committee calling on protests to basically get the government to resign the tax reform, the really neoliberal tax reform that was going to basically destroy the world popular economy. A lot of basic necessities were going to be touched, etc. But the protests weren't that big, and the protests were successfully, actually, in less than 2 days of general strike, we managed to completely destroy the tax reform, and the finance minister resigned, and all of that. But we were pissed off about the debts. Actually, I didn't protest myself during the first day of the general strike because I was scared of because of COVID. I have a precision condition, and I might die. So yeah, I was like, well,
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing with you.
Yeah.
yeah, I hope they win. But I started sounding brutal repression, and one night I was watching a live broadcasting of a protest in Cali, and I saw how the army killed two protesters in front of me, like, wow. And I just told my mom, sorry, but tomorrow I have to go protest, and that's like the main reason why the young are all in the streets. The first few days were mostly only trade union workers, unionized workers, a lot of that. But when we started saying the brutal repression, we came to the street to protest that. The National Strike Committee actually has already won, like I said, because the goal was achieved. There is no tax reform anymore. But we are continuing the street because of the repression. We go to protest on Monday because on Sunday they killed 10 people, and then we go protest on Wednesday because on Monday they raped 3 girls, and then on Friday because on Wednesday when we were protesting the rape of the 3 girls, they killed 20 people, and all of that. We are just pissed and scared about the death.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
and we don't hear about that in the West at all, as I said earlier. Maybe it comes across the ticker at the bottom of the screen, but
it's usually very vague, like
right.
protests turn violent, or clashes.
And the youth is really, really radical right now, like seriously radical. For example, we actually organize ourselves in lines. There are like 3 to 5 lines, depending on the level of organization and the number of people. It's like we are organized. I feel like in a mentality of war,
Mm-hmm. No, and I've seen videos of some of the formations.
Yes,
With
the first liners
shields and
are the people with shields, and the second liners are people with rods and Molotov cocktails, and people that disable tear gas. Tear flying is people with milk, vinegar for tear gas, and all of that. Most fear liners here in my town are actually anarchists. It's wild. There's a lot of radical people coming on the street, and a lot of people has been radicalized in a couple of weeks, really. That's why the National Strike Committee don't represent us, because we are more radical than them, and
so does this round of strikes and protests, does this feel different to you? I realize that you're young, yes. And so, but is that what the kind of sense that this is different? That this is a real radical uprising against neoliberal completely. And austerity? Yeah.
Completely. Like I said, we had in 2016 with the peace accords, we had a couple of protests because we had a referendum. And the no option won, no to peace. But we, the youth, came to the street to protest because we wanted peace, because we are tired of basically deaths. It was really peaceful, etc. And they were educators and teachers had their own strike a couple of years ago. I am an indigenous person, so I have been participating in strikes since I was born, because we indigenous people here in Colombia protest a lot to take back our land.
Yeah.
I participated in a national indigenous strike in 2014, and then in the national student strike in 2018, and the national general strike of 2019, etc., etc. But this strike is special. Like I said, we are really, really organized. In previous strikes, people were like, no, people protest, no violence. Like, for example, if you were marching down the street and some people started throwing rocks at like stores or the police, people like, no, 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 don't do that, don't do that. We are peaceful, and right now, people just want to burn the shit out. Like, people actually celebrate when they see the frontliners come to the protest. People are donating a lot of money to arm the protest, to help us make some radical changes. Yes, this is like the biggest strike that I have seen in my whole life. This is something. This is truly something. I think that we are doing something. Yeah.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it, and I'm in full solidarity with what you're trying to do. I'm wondering maybe if we could go back a little bit, or not even back, but you've mentioned it, the 2016 supposed accords. But I want to talk about FARC, if we could, for a little bit, because in the West, that's usually the only thing we hear about Colombia is FARC, 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 kidnapping people in the jungle, this and that. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So can you break that down and, from your experience, actually tell us what the deal actually is with regard to FARC? Yeah, and its
really
relationship with the government.
That's a really sensible country. That is a really sensible topic here in my country. Well, the civil war was basically started because in the 50s they killed leftist leader Gaitan, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. He was actually he was a candidate for the Liberal Party. Yes, they killed a liberal because he was too radical. Also, people took to the jungle, and FARC basically started, mostly with peasants. Most, people really, really supported FARC back in the day. But because of leftist infighting, basically, a lot of other guerrilla movements were formed. Like, for example, we have the National Liberation Army, who they are Christian socialists. They support something called liberation theology, which is a mixture of Marxism-Leninism and Christianity. We have the M19 guerrilla movement, which was actually a democratic guerrilla, because the state stole one election, and so they took to the jungle demanding more democracy. That's weird. That's like 17th century shit, having liberal guerrillas. We had two indigenous guerrilla movement. One was called, I don't remember the name of the guy, but he was an indigenous leader, etc. We had a lot of guerrilla movements. They became intertwined with two cartels in the 80s. That's when the approval started falling down. They did some deals with Pablo Escobar because they wanted to finance the revolution, basically. But they became intertwined with the cartel interests, and they started doing some crimes against humanity, and it was for the greater good, but people didn't. I don't see it like that. I mean, for me, it was completely delegitimized. But FARC still had some ideals, but people hate them basically for what they did. Actually, in 1991, we had a peace accord with M19, and we drafted a new constitution, like Chile. And for most people, 1991 was like the last opportunity for guerrilla movement to insert themselves in democratic society. Because we in that constitution we did a lot of democratic reforms. Like we used to have an electoral system like in the U.S., but now we have proportional representation. It baffles me that in the U.S. 49% of the votes equals 0% of the representation. That's real wild. Here in Colombia, 3% of the vote, 3% of the representation, 10%, etc. It's really good. So yeah, but FARC insisted in the armed conflict. Then in 2006, the Communist Party actually disavowed FARC completely because the official position of the Communist Party in 2006 was we need peace. We aren't doing the revolution anymore. We aren't going to win. So FARC continued to try to overthrow the government. They couldn't. So in 2016, they firmed a peace accord with Juan Manuel Santos. Yeah, people sort of hate FARC here in Colombia. Leftists understand the struggle, but don't actually like FARC. Like we know that they made a lot of strategic mistakes, and they should just ended the war in 1991. That's the position. They shouldn't continue fighting.
Yeah,
That's why the National Liberation Army is even more hated than FARC because even FARC demobilized. They continue back in the jungle. Yeah.
right.
That's,
And certainly if this is true, what we hear, and I think it is because I haven't just engaged with it in mainstream sources, but I'm almost certain that the kidnappings and the holdings for ransom haven't helped the FARC movement at all.
yeah. No. People hate them because they made a lot of mistakes. A lot. The most loved guerrilla was M19 because they only targeted the state. FARC, because it was a peasant guerrilla, they targeted like big industrialists and people with money. But it's a lot simpler to sympathize with a normal civilian with money than with a state official. Then I think only targeted the state. Only
Yeah,
the state.
sorry to interrupt. That's so true though, because I worked with a woman for about a year doing a contract job, and she's Colombian, and her sister was kidnapped by FARC, and they asked for a ransom to return her, so to speak. And she was from a well-to-do family, so they were able to pay the ransom, and her sister was able to get back to freedom. But again, as you said, she was from a well-to-do family, and it seems like, well, it's not. It seems they do target well-to-do families because they know they're going to get the money. But I'm wondering if you can speak a little more to the class divide that is in Colombia, because it seems like there is a very big one, that there's a fracture almost between.
Yeah, you mentioned that earlier, that Colombia is one of the most unequal. Like there's the inequality is just unbelievable. I mean, when I was doing research to talk to you, I think it's something like 43% live in poverty, 15% live in extreme poverty. And so, yeah, can we talk a little bit about that and how we've gotten to that point? Or has it always been that way, I guess?
I have two processes. I have 43% live in poverty. In our poverty line is basically less than $100 a month. Our poverty line is 1/4 the minimum wage. And the minimum wage is an starvation wage completely. It's completely an starvation wage. You can't even afford rent with minimum wage, and 60% of workers don't even make minimum wage. They make less than minimum wage. It's horrible, completely horrible. You guys actually have a public pension system with Social Security. We don't have that around here. Most people don't retire. They just die of exhaustion, basically. So yeah, we have a lot of inequality. The neoliberal reforms of the 90s really helped with that. In the 90s, neoliberalism was introduced to the country after the pilot successful experiment of Chile. And we copied a lot of institutions from Chile and a lot from the United States. And inequality has really soared since then. We have some absolute poverty here in Colombia. Like, for example, I live in a town which is 1 hour away from my state capital, Barranquilla. I normally say my city, Barranquilla, but I don't really live in Barranquilla, so people know. But yeah, in Barranquilla, 2/3 of the population don't eat 3 times a day, for example. And Barranquilla is one of the wealthiest cities in the whole country. Like the GDP per capita of Barranquilla is really, really high for Colombian level. Really, the oligarchy just stole out. So yeah, inequality is really high here in Colombia. We see people that live like kings, while most of us can't even afford food. Not even rent. Like, affording rent is like a two-tier necessity. Most people can't afford food, basically. We had some bizarre dishes, like, for example, rice and tomato sauce. Yeah, most people just eat rice because rice is cheap. We do drink a lot of coffee. Most people prefer coffee instead of a meal. I don't know why. It's like a cultural thing. Yeah. Yes. I guess we just really love coffee. The peasants, inequality in the rural sector is even higher than in the urban sector. Most peasants are landless peasants. They work for the oligarchy, the latifundios. And so we need a land reform because we haven't had a land reform. You guys had a land reform, called the Homestead Act and the Indian Removal Act. It was really racist, but it was a land reform. We haven't had that. We still have like pseudo feudal lords here in our country that completely control their territory. How do you call hacienda? We call it haciendas. Are big, yes, kilometers of land. The hacienda of Uribe is actually bigger than a lot of towns, for example. So yeah, inequality is really high. I don't know another question. Sorry for my back English.
No, that's okay.
You're fine. You're fine.
And it really gives the lie to what we've heard about Venezuela, where the government at least tries under sanctions to take care of its citizenry. And what we constantly hear in the West, at least, is Maduro this, Maduro that, and Chavismo is like Satan reincarnated. But
Actually, before Maduro, most people here loved Chavez.
yeah, that's
Here in Colombia, people really liked Chavez. It was
Right.
weird.
Mm-hmm.
In one state of Colombia called Guajira. Uh, it's the ancient lands of the Wayu people. They are desert nomads, basically. They have been starving because the government basically gave away the rivers to multinational corporations to extract coal and oil. So they have been starving, but during Chavez government, Chavez actually basically gave away a lot of food and basic necessities to the Wayu people. He subsidized a lot of poor people here in Colombia, even though the government hated him. He was a really nice guy. But Maduro, well, it's complicated.
Right.
Yes. No, and it really the only reason we hear anything about Maduro is because he's far too left for the United States. He's not a puppet, and so he has to be painted as a dictator, and somebody who's out of control, and so that way that we can justify overthrowing his government. That's basically how that works. Yeah, so I don't know. You talked about the points of resistance, though, and I wanted to touch on the fact that when we were DMing on Twitter, you said that you were letting ambulances and food through, but then the cops caught on to that, and so now that they're infiltrating ambulances and things, and now shooting protesters from those vehicles. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that people need to really recognize the level of violence being perpetrated by the state. I think that's really important that people understand. Because again, in the West, we aren't seeing this. There are very few sort of smaller or global media organizations that we can see some videos or, some articles that are being written. But for the most part, it's very quiet. So I don't think people know just how pervasive the violence is in the streets right now.
Just as, like I said, we don't want to kill people with the strike, so that's why we let ambulance and food pass by the police and resistance. And we actually had some humanitarian corridors where people can freely pass, like for example, secondary streets. Day on, day off. Sometimes we lift off the point of resistance so people can go to work, etc. We talk a lot with the general population, and most people support the strike. Actually, I saw. How do you? I don't remember the word for that. Like when you ask random people on the street, when you ask random people on the street their opinion on something.
I don't know.
Sorry.
No,
I have
it's
been
fine.
talking English for 1 hour. I get to make some mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I also think
Uh,
it's part of the fact that it's partly the fact that you live in a country, in a sector of that country, even where you have to be super careful about what you say. It's not like you're trying to center yourself, but
yeah.
your life really is at risk.
Yeah.
And that's what most Americans don't get.
Well, but yeah, most people support the strike. The government has caught on the fact that we let ambulance pass by, so they have started using ambulance to first transport ammunition. Like we saw ambulance full of either anti-riot ammunition. It was like a dick move, but okay, like tear gas. We are accustomed to tear gas. But later we saw them transporting like real war ammunition, assault rifles, etc. And later, they started actually transporting soldiers or paramilitary groups, and they started shooting us from the ambulance. So now we have to do a complete inquiry in every ambulance that we let pass. Like, we don't just leave the point, we have to stop the ambulance, see what's in there, etc. It's very disappointing because, well, someone might die waiting in the. We have to do it because either we do it or they kill us.
Right.
It's a really tough call. It's not a call we like to make, but we have to do it. One girl actually tragically died. Uh, Another one died, but not because but because of the police. She was killed in hiding tear gas. Yeah.
But it really is life or death either way. I mean, you put your life at risk if you don't stop the ambulance and search it, and then you also risk that somebody may not get the medical attention that they need. So, I mean, that's a tough spot to be in.
Yes. Like I said, we don't like to do it. We just have to.
Right.
It's it, it's really something. Yeah, being in a point of resistance is really something. Like for example, last week where we were blockading the the highway, a cop shot at us. Fortunately, nobody died. But one of the first liners uh, said, "Hey, can you lend me your phone so I can call my home?" And he started talking with his children. He started to say, "Hey, baby, don't worry about it. I am going to come home." I was panicking. He was like, and I said, "Fuck, man, go to your home." Like, fuck, you have children waiting for you. I have nobody, only my mom. Yeah, it's really something.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's, as you were just describing, that personal side, that really personal side of even just individuals. We never even get close to that, a picture of that in the US. Maybe in some independent media that do a good job. And that's a tragedy. That's actually a tragedy. And while we've been talking, Dan Cohen, who's been doing some really good work on Colombia, tweeted two things out that I think are worth mentioning. And the first one is in response to Marco Rubio, who I don't think needs any introduction.
No.
And he tweeted, hashtag Venezuela bought attack boats from hashtag Iran last year, but only now are they trying to deliver them. Ignore the petty sniping from Biden official and focus on what matters. Either hashtag Maduro unconditionally turns them away or US should force them to turn around. And Dan responded or subtweeted, the US and Israel sell genocidal Colombian narco-state weapons for repeated attempts to exterminate its dissidents and overthrow the Venezuelan government. But as soon as Venezuela buys a couple boats to defend itself, it's casus belli, the logic of imperialism. And then he added on to that, assuming it's true that Iran is delivering fast attack boats, it would make perfect sense for Venezuela to buy them in order to deter US-backed mercenary invasions like Operation Gideon last year. So the Gray Zone also just put out a piece about all of what I just mentioned. So that said, I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about Colombia and Venezuela, because again, we've been hearing about the supposed intentional starvation of Venezuelans, but at the same time, there were and there have been actual famines, if you will, going on in parts of Colombia, especially the indigenous sections.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Venezuela is a really touchy subject here in Colombia. Actually, we left it. We don't have a unifying position of Venezuela yet. Because, like I said, we loved Chavez completely because of all the good work he did and all of that. But Maduro, the problem with Maduro is that he's trying to basically defend his country from the U.S. and he has to make a lot of tough calls. He has done some authoritarian shit, but like I understand, but it's complicated and the economic situation in Venezuela is really dire. But I understand that it's because of the sanction and etc. Venezuela is too complicated even for us. Like it's not black and white. I think. Like for example, the Communist Party of Venezuela actually broke away from the government coalition because Maduro is trying to basically appease international corporation. He is privatizing some of the enterprise that Chavez nationalized back in the day, etc. He is renegotiating.
What are some of those enterprises?
I don't know. Chavez nationalized a lot of stuff.
Okay,
hotels, names, factories, etc.
Right.
A lot of enterprise. He is sort of privatizing the national petroleum company PDVSA to the Chinese government, sort of, because it's to another government. The Chinese government actually works like a private corporation sometimes here in Latin America. It's complicated. So the Communist Party of Venezuela actually broke away from the government coalition of Venezuela because Maduro is diverting from the way that the Chavez started the revolution. But we will see. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't imagine being, a Maduro and trying to not only run your country but protect your country from, Western Empire. That's a lot. That's a lot to even just think about. So yeah, you're right. I think it is very complicated.
Yes. So that's why I can't give a clear talk about Venezuela. I don't know. Tough. I don't know what is happening. I don't know what might happen with Maduro. It's too complicated.
Yes, you're right.
Here in Colombia, we actually have a refugee crisis with Venezuela. A lot of Venezuela are coming to Colombia. Lots. Some of them are returning back because they discovered that Colombia is in the paradise that they were promised by the U.S. news, basically, and they discovered that they are starving here too. But some of them are still here, mostly on the streets. They are no beggars, or they have turned to organized crime, etc. It's really something painful to watch.
Yeah, agreed.
But I don't think that is a problem that Venezuela can solve alone, or that Colombia and Venezuela can solve the two of them. I think that is a Latin American level problem. Like I think that we need to revive UNASUR. UNASUR was like a European Union, but for South America, we need to do it. Like UNASUR is the perfect entity to solve the Venezuelan crisis. And we might be able to do that with Pedro Castillo in Peru and the new constitution in Chile. And if we are lucky, with Gustavo Petro in Colombia in the next year. He doesn't actually support any of that, but we can pressure it we can pressure him into doing that.
I think UNASUR though I think it's a fair comparison to the EU, but I think it's much more liberation oriented.
Yes,
The EU is not, obviously. The
No.
EU is an imperial entity
Right.
and has no
EU,
concern for
that's
liberation
really
of
interesting
anybody.
for me because the EU imposes the neoliberal orthodoxy in a lot of countries, while the UNASUR was a leftist project.
Yeah. We really need
That,
like a global solidarity movement against empire. We really
actually,
do.
that's why the UNASUR collapsed because Latin America turned to the right for a couple of years, and we didn't have a leftist majority in the continent, so UNASUR collapsed because UNASUR was explicitly a leftist project. With solidarity and cash transfers between the countries and free movement of people and merchandise, but a lot of nationalization, and it was a leftist project. It was actually based on Bolivarianism, ideology of Simon Bolivar, because he proposed that back in the days of independence. Like I said, there are the United States of North America, but here in Latin America, we are the United People. And he proposed a Gran Colombia, a great republic, or Union of Republic, Confederation of Republic, that protect themselves, contrary to the Monroe Pact. That for me is very interesting because the Monroe Doctrine was basically imperialism, while the Bolivarian doctrine was self-protection and mutual aid and all of that. So
Yeah,
una question on that.
and I think there's a valid comparison to be made with regard to pan-Arab nationalism, for lack of a better term. We've seen Arab states, if you will, try to unite in their own sort of coalition, maybe not necessarily of liberation, but to form some sort of cohesive entity to make life better for the people in those countries, but also to stave off the West in a way, because as we've seen in the Middle East, as we've seen in Latin America, as we've seen in South America, the West is just relentless in
Africa.
Africa,
Everywhere.
everywhere, Afghanistan, they're just
Yeah.
relentless in trying to destroy not only anything they deem leftist, but anything that has to do with people's self-determination.
Hmm.
Oh, I know. Like I said, I have a military. I use military bases 15 minutes away from my home.
Hmm.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's why I think we need a global solidarity movement against empire. I think it's really necessary. I don't know how on earth we're going to make that happen, but I think it would be extremely beneficial to the globe as a whole. I mean, the West has to be stopped. It really does. So I don't want to keep you too much longer. You've been very generous with your time. Is there anything that you like that we didn't touch on or that you want people to know, or how can people help?
Oh,
How
yes.
can I mean, yeah, tell us, like, I know that a lot of people really want to help, like they want to be involved and show solidarity. So, I mean, whatever we can do, please tell us.
Yes.
Yeah, and also, where can people find more information, good
Yes.
information?
Mhm. Well, they have to speak Spanish to have good information. Just follow Organizer for Colombia in Twitter. Like for example, you can follow the Communist Party, or you can follow myself.
Yeah.
If that is, etc. You can help actually sending us money. I don't want to sound like an evil capitalist, but shields aren't cheap. We need money to buy shields, anti-riot armor, to protect ourselves basically from bullets. We need money to buy food and to buy medicine, etc. Nationally, there is a mutual aid fund in a platform called Baki. It's like a GoFundMe for Colombia. You can donate from all over the world, but the Spanish is in Spanish. The page is in Spanish, so you have to maybe use some Google Translate.
How is that? How is that spelled?
Baki. B, like a small B. B.
Okay. And
A.
then A, or A C or a K? K. Okay. Got it. All right.
Yeah,
So,
we can link to that in the show
yeah,
notes. So anybody
we'll
that
link
wants
to
to
that for
contribute,
sure.
yeah,
There is a
definitely.
national mutual aid fund, but my group isn't getting any of money from that mutual aid fund. So we made it a local mutual aid fund. I invite you to. Your dollars really, really, really go a long way here in Colombia. A long, long way. Or money is worthless. So, like for example, our minimum wage is $200. We can make a lot with $200. We can rent 4 buses with $20, like for example. So yeah, you can donate money to our cause if you want to help. You can shout out any leftists that you see online and show that of action so the world can see them. In general, just show some solidarity with our cause. That's like the best way to do it.
Yeah, we'll spread the word as much as possible, especially because it doesn't even matter if it's a so-called flare-up that's happening in Colombia or if there's peace, which I don't think has been the case for a long time. But it's necessary to help y'all because whether there's something going on or not, you're still fighting for self-determination. And as you said, the capitalist currency there is something that obviously you can't control, but it's also something that's destroying lives. And so it behooves us to help out. And as I said, we'll definitely spread the word as far and wide as we can.
Yes. And thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe. I mean, I know that sounds really cliche, but, do what you can to keep yourself safe while you're fighting this fight. And we do stand in solidarity with you. I mean, I know it's easy for us to say from the U.S. and when we're not in the middle of it, but as much as we can, we absolutely do stand in solidarity with you in the movement. So thank you for coming on and talking about it. I know that it's risky for you to do so. So we appreciate you taking the time to do it. And anybody, if you can support the movement, we'll make sure that the link is in the show description so that you can donate to the cause. Make sure you're following people on the ground in Colombia so that you're getting legitimate information, share their voices, amplify their voices as much as you can, because mainstream media is not covering this stuff. So as much as we can help beat the algorithms and all that stuff and really put this to the forefront of people's minds, we really should try to do that as much as possible. So thank you so much again for coming on. I really appreciate it. Thank you everybody for watching. And we'll catch you next time.
Thanks, Julian.
Bye.